Hello, everybody. This is Menopause Barbie, your menopause tailor, bringing you the state of menopause in the world today and helping you tailor everything to create your menopause your way. You are learning so much about heart attacks. We are right in the middle of a unit on nothing but heart attacks, and it's the most important topic of all. So this topic today is on the risk factors for a heart attack, and I call it How to Know If You're at Risk for a Heart Attack. It's such important information, and I hope you find it obvious as to why you need to listen to this, because heart attacks kill more women than anything else, and you definitely need to know if you're at risk for a heart attack. And this podcast will help you learn that. So let's start by telling you the term, the definition for the term risk factors. Risk factors, they are all the individual things that can contribute to your risk for a disease. And it's very rare for a disease to be caused by just one thing. Instead, most diseases occur as a result of many different factors contributing to the likelihood of that disease. And each one raises your risk a little bit. If you have enough of the risk factors, your risk is high. For instance, if there are 15 factors that increase your risk for a disease and you have only 2 of them, you might still be at low risk for the disease. But if you have 10 of them, you're probably at very high risk for the disease. But that's not all. Some risk factors have more bearing than others. Sometimes your genetics carry the most weight. Sometimes your lifestyle does. With heart attack, you already know from the last podcast that your family history does not carry the most weight in contributing to your risk for heart attack. Your diet, lifestyle, and habits are much more important in determining your risk than your family history. So today I'm going to present the whole list of risk factors that contribute to a heart attack, and I'll explain each one of them. And I'll point out the ones that weigh extra heavily for women, because there are some things that are more important with regard to females and heart attacks. And now I'm going to tell you something that's going to make you really angry. If you are postmenopausal, you are at high risk for a heart attack, period. Losing your estrogen all by itself is enough to make you high risk for a heart attack. Losing your estrogen is precisely what puts you at risk for a heart attack during postmenopause. The incidence of heart attacks increases exponentially when you become postmenopausal. If you take women at any age, those who are postmenopausal have a much higher incidence of heart attack than those who are not. So loss of your estrogen is a huge independent risk factor, and it's the very reason that heart attack is the most important aspect of menopause. How often do you hear of a woman having a heart attack before she's postmenopausal? Hardly ever. Loss of estrogen makes your arteries start hardening. And we'll talk a lot more about this later on when we're talking about hormonal options for preventing a heart attack. But now we'll delve into all the other things that put you at high risk for a heart attack. But I want you to add everything else I tell you today to the one simple fact that postmenopause is a risk factor all by itself. And you can't change the fact that you're postmenopausal, but you can change a lot of the other things. So let's start in on our list, and I'm just going to go through topics one by one. The first risk factor is a personal history of a heart attack yourself. Simply put, if you've already had a heart attack, you're at high risk of having another one. You've already demonstrated that you're at high risk. And I would hope that one heart attack would be a huge wake-up call that induced you to adopt a much healthier lifestyle. And if that wasn't enough to wake you up, I don't know what it would take to get your attention. Unfortunately, the majority of women who have had one heart attack have died from it. They don't get a second chance. If you get a second chance, make the best of it. And I will be giving you options for reducing your risk of heart attack in the future. Okay, there's no reason to suffer a second heart attack with so many options for preventing it, or a first one for that matter. Okay, next is smoking. Smoking actually lowers the age at which you become postmenopausal by 2 years. The more you smoke, the earlier you'll become postmenopausal, and menopause itself serves to increase your risk for a heart attack. So, how much does smoking increase your risk for a heart attack? Well, it increases it by 1.5 to 1.7 times. Smoking causes more than half of the deaths due to heart attack in women under the age of 65. And no matter how long you've smoked, you will decrease your risk of a heart attack by quitting. After just 1 year of not smoking, you will have decreased your risk by 50%. And after 3 years of not smoking, you will have nearly erased the increased risk that you created by smoking in the first place. So this is one risk factor that you can erase right now. Next is a high, lousy LDL. This is the one that collects in your arteries to block blood and oxygen flow to your heart. So the higher your LDL, the greater your risk for a heart attack. And for purposes of risk factors, any LDL value greater than 130 milligrams per deciliter or greater than 1.5 millimoles per liter is too high. And the average person has a high risk of heart attack. Don't be cavalier about this. Don't minimize the frequency or severity of heart attacks. Be cautious. And in every list of risk factors, the lab value that qualifies for high risk is based on studies that prove its qualifications as such. Okay, so alongside a high LDL is a low, healthy HDL. In HDL is your healthy cholesterol. You want a lot of it. It's the one that floats, and because it floats, it does not collect in your arteries or contribute to heart attacks. So if your HDL is low, you're at high risk for a heart attack. An HDL lower than 46 milligrams per deciliter or lower than 1.5 millimoles per liter is considered high risk. And this is one of the factors that is more important in women than it is in men. In other words, if you have a low HDL and your brother has a low HDL, your HDL is much more significant than his. You are much more likely to have a heart attack than he is. This gender difference is significant. If your brother increases his HDL by 1 milligram per deciliter, it will reduce his risk of heart attack by 2%. But if you, as a female, increase your HDL by just that same 1 milligram per deciliter, it will reduce your risk of heart attack by 3%. So you get much more benefit from increasing your HDL than your brother does. But if you don't increase your HDL, you have much more risk. Either way, HDL is much more significant for women. The next risk factor is the ratio of total cholesterol to HDL. If your total cholesterol over your healthy HDL is less than or equal to 4, you're at low risk. And if it's greater than 4, you're at high risk. Notice that your value of total cholesterol all by itself does not constitute one of the risk factors. That's because your total cholesterol consists of both the lousy LDL and the healthy HDL. What's important is that you have a lot of the good stuff and just a little bit of the bad stuff. Next is high triglycerides. This is another one. A high triglyceride of over 200 milligrams per deciliter or over 2.2 millimoles per liter puts you at high risk of heart attack. And this is another one that is more significant for women than it is for men. So women have to take it a lot more seriously and do something about it. Next is obesity. Now, for purposes of a heart attack risk, obesity is defined as either a body weight greater than 25% over your ideal weight or a body mass index greater than 25. And these two things are not the same. Weight charts simply designate normal weight ranges based on gender and height. But your weight is composed of your soft tissue, your fat, your bones, and your muscle. And no weight chart takes into account those different components. And then there's BMI. BMI, body mass index, uses both your height and your weight to determine whether you're underweight, normal weight, overweight, obese, or morbidly obese. And you can calculate it by either system. And if your BMI is below 18.5, you're underweight. If it's between 18.5 and 24.9, you're normal. Between 25 and 29, you're overweight. And between 30 and 39.9, you're obese. Above 40 or 40 and above, you are morbidly obese. But again, BMI does not take into account fat versus muscles. You know, those big muscular bodybuilders, they all have morbidly obese BMI values. So if you have a lot of muscle, your BMI is not very helpful. But if you've got a lot of fat, it is. In general, the more obese you are, the higher your risk for a heart attack. But the next factor is much more important than your weight. Next is how much fat you have in your abdomen. We have a name for that. It's called truncal obesity. Your abdomen is your trunk. See, contrary to pop music's designation of your butt as your trunk, it's really your torso that constitutes your trunk. So it is appropriate to say junk in your trunk, but the trunk is your abdomen. In other words, if you have an obese belly, you have a much greater risk of a heart attack. And as with everything in medicine, we have specific parameters for truncal obesity. Truncal obesity can be defined in one of three ways. It's a waist measurement of greater than 35 inches or 89 centimeters, or a waist to hip ratio of greater than 0.8, or an apple shape rather than a pear shape. Lots of different ways to describe that. So the next thing is high blood pressure. Now, first let me say something very basic. High blood pressure and hypertension are the very same thing. I've encountered women who didn't know that. And in teaching, I always assume you know nothing. And that way, as long as you start at the beginning and listen to the podcasts in order or watch my videos in order or whatever you do, do it in order, there's no way you won't understand something. For purposes of your risk of heart attack, a blood pressure greater than 130/85 puts you at high risk. And that may or may not even qualify for the definition of true hypertension, but it still increases your risk for a heart attack. High blood pressure and heart attacks go hand in hand. You pretty much always see them together. Next is diabetes. Now this one's a biggie. There are two types of diabetes. Type 1 is also called juvenile diabetes because it's the one people discover when they're very, very young. They have to take insulin their entire life, and it has absolutely nothing to do with being overweight. But the other type of diabetes is diabetes type 2. That's the one people develop at an older age. Another name for it is adult onset diabetes. And it is directly and absolutely associated with being overweight. It doesn't typically require insulin, and it does respond to changes in your diet and activity. And it is also the one that increases your risk for a heart attack. This is the diabetes that is caused by eating too much sugar, eating too much fat, being sedentary, and being overweight. It's the one that is associated with causing